Hello, I'm Oliver Fairclough, and I'm recording this message on the 19th of May 2020 from my home in the Black Mountains near Abergavenny. It seems an age away since I gave this lecture at Highgate in early February this year. I thought I just ought to add a few remarks to it now. Firstly, to say that it was given to a London audience that I felt would be relatively unfamiliar with Welsh art, so do please forgive me for stating the obvious in places. Also, it's 5 years now since I retired from the National Museum of Wales, and in fairness to them and to myself, I should say that these are very much the ramblings of a retired museum curator and do not represent any sort of official policy or view. Nevertheless, I think it's worth sharing the lecture further, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.
Well, thank you very much for asking me, and must I glad to the Welsh contingent. I'm delighted to see. When I was asked to do this, I decided that I would take Kyffin Williams as my subject, because after all this is a Kyffin Williams lecture. And I'll be talking about a lengthy relationship which, I should say at the start, was not without tensions on either side, as Kyffin was at times both a generous supporter and also a trenchant critic of the National Museum. However, as I knew him personally during the latter part of that relationship, it seemed worth remembering him and putting this talk together, and I have to say I've greatly enjoyed doing so, because he was a remarkable man, a very fine artist, as you'll see, but also a tremendous wit and raconteur, and somebody who treated me with real kindness when I first arrived at the National Museum of Wales, Amgueddfa Cymru, in 1986, and for the next 20 years up until his death in 2006. To wake this thing up. My first image, and I'm sorry these are a little bit small, but perhaps I shouldn't have done multi-slides, but there we are. This is Kyffin as I remember him at the museum in Cardiff, but also at Pythefynogo, his cottage on the Anglesey side of the Menai Straits. And in those days, in the 90s, he was in many respects a grand old man. I mean, he was something of an establishment figure. He was knighted towards the end of his life. He was Deputy Lieutenant of the County of Gwynedd, with a military moustache and a penchant for three-piece tweed suits, but passionately committed to his craft as a landscape painter and a draftsman, as you can see there, and also a very proud North Walian. So Kyffin is one half of my subject. The other half is Amgueddfa Cymru, the National Museum of Wales, and perhaps a quick explanation here. This is the original National Museum building, founded. The museum was founded in 1907. This building was begun in 1912. It's now one of 8 sites, I think it is, run by the National Museum, which is funded by the Welsh Assembly Government, and because of the brilliant organisation here, you've actually got leaflets for all of them on the table there. So do help yourselves afterwards. However, I like to think the National Museum in Cardiff is the original and best, certainly the oldest, and the others all followed in the second half of the 20th century. For many years, the art galleries occupied the upper floor of what is the far side on that slide. Though, as you'll hear, they now occupy the whole of the upper floor of the building because they've expanded considerably in the 90s and 2000s, and I was very fortunate in that respect to actually be involved in those projects. And we have to remember that for most of the time Kyffin was associated with the museum, our collections were crammed into 7 or 8 relatively small galleries on the far side of the building. Kyffin Williams was a member of the committee that advised the museum on its art policy, including acquisitions, between 1964 and 1996. In his resignation letter, he said he'd done 40 years and he thought that was long enough. It was actually about 32 years, but still that's, I think, pretty good record. He was the only artist member of that committee, and his particular concern was how the National Museum represented Welsh art and Welsh artists, including, I have to say, himself. My next image is one you won't be able to read, but it's my favourite newspaper, the Western Mail, so-called National Paper of Wales, from May 2004. And here we have Kyffin saying we should be buying more work by Welsh artists, and it's a scandal that we didn't, etc., etc. And there's a certain irony here, because he was dismissive of much contemporary art in Wales, though a loyal supporter of selected younger artists who he felt deserved wider appreciation. And looking back at it today, Kyffin's blast at the Western Mail, to the Western Mail in 2004, was another expression of the tension between the national and the international in the arts in Wales that's existed ever since the National Museum was founded in 1907. We have to remember that, unlike Scotland and Ireland, Wales has no national art gallery, and its public collections of art are to be found in its National Museum, in the National Library in Aberystwyth, and in a number of mostly smaller regional museums. And both the National Museum and the National Library were founded in 1907 and were a belated response to the growth of Welsh national consciousness during the late 19th century that the government eventually found by 1907 that it had to do something about. This is the mission statement at the top, coined by the National Museum's first president and veteran campaigner for Welsh institutions, Alfred Thomas Lord Pontypridd, and it's quite unambiguous. The purpose of the museum is to teach the world about Wales and the Welsh people about their fatherland. The founding charter, on the other hand, and maybe the charter of Highgate School does this too, is anything but straightforward and is decidedly ambiguous. It states that the museum's objectives should be mainly and primarily the complete illustration of the geology, mineralogy, zoology, botany, ethnography, archaeology, art, and we sometimes wonder whether it was art, history, or just art history, and the special industries of Wales, but then also a get-out clause. The collection of all objects and things, including pictures, engravings, statuary, and all other works of fine art of any kind, whether or not connected with Wales, and further educational research. This was partly to make sense of the fact that the National Museum had taken over the collections of the former Cardiff Municipal Museum, which included a fairly standard Victorian municipal collection, including some quite decent Victorian and 19th century French paintings. However, the Charter poses the question, what is the art history of Wales? Is it a canon of great Welsh-born artists? Is it one of artists whose work addresses Wales and its people? Or is the art history of Wales a study of the particular within broader European cultural development? And we're still sort of agonising about that nearly 100 years, and over 100 years later. But I'm going to take us briefly back to 1912, when my predecessor, the first keeper of art, Isaac Williams, himself an artist, took up his post, having come from the Cyfarthfa Castle Museum in Merthyr. And this is Isaac Williams' first exhibition, which had the snappy title, Works by Certain Modern Artists of Welsh Birth or Extraction. This was actually not put on in the museum itself, which was sort of about knee-high at that point, the foundation stone having been laid a couple of years before, but in a temporary hut in the courtyard of Cardiff City Hall, splendidly upholstered, and I do wish I'd seen it, because we have a number of photographs of it and of the works in it. But as the title indicates, it was a show of artists with some familial connections to Wales, Often, in fact, those connections were very remote because it included artists like Benjamin Leader, who's the artist of the landscape at the bottom, Edward Burne-Jones, G.F. Watts, sculpture by people like Adrian Jones, who's the man responsible for the quadriga at Marble Arch, and much else, and also sculpture by this man, William Goscombe John, Cardiff born in 1860, pupil of Rodin, one of the younger of the British new sculptors of the 1890s. And on the near side of the screen, one of his masterworks, the marble sculpture of St David Daisynt in Cardiff City Hall. But behind him, in the portrait, two of his principal works, the kneeling figure of the elf and the standing figures of John the Baptist, which are both in the Cardiff collection. John was a long-standing member of the museum's governing council and indeed an influential figure in the cultural revival that brought the museum about. And I sometimes think of him as a sort of Kyffin predecessor. Both Isaac Williams, the first keeper, and William Goscombe John were fascinated by the 18th century Welsh landscape painter Richard Wilson, and as far as they were concerned, the art history of Wales started with Richard Wilson. And here they both are in 1923, looking a bit like Laurel and Hardy. You can see Goscombe John, you recognise Goscombe John by his beard, and Isaac Williams is the little man in the bowler hat. But they're marching through the streets of Mould with the Gorseth bards, and they're laying a wreath on Richard Wilson's tomb, which is in the churchyard in Mould. And not surprisingly, the first major work acquired by the National Museum was Richard Wilson's, or one of the versions of Richard Wilson's Carnarvon Castle on the top of the screen there, painted in the 1760s. And you've also got Richard Wilson painted in Rome by one of the great European artists of the 18th century, Anton Raphael Mengs, because Wilson was in Rome for the first half of the 1750s and abandoned portrait painting, which was probably a good thing, and became, as we argued in an exhibition in 2014, slightly with our tongue in cheek, but only slightly, he was the father of European landscape painting. And here he is depicted as a landscape painter, indeed, holding his easel with a landscape oil, holding his palette with a landscape oil on his easel. Also shown, incidentally, very much as the gentleman of leisure. The museum's early canon of Welsh artists included John Gibson, the sculptor seen here. This is the Wounded Amazon. Gibson came from Conwy. He was born in 1790 and died in 1866. And he and the upper painting there, which is by Penry Williams, he and Penry Williams spent most of their working life in Rome. That's the Williams' Mass for the Reapers, painted in 1855 in Rome, and I bought it, but it actually came from a collection in Sweden, because Penry Williams, like Gibson, was very much an international property. And then below, looking a bit like a Rubens, is actually a painting by Frank Brangwyn, the Anglo-Welsh painter, who was born in Bruges, and that's a picture called Bacchanal of 1907, which is one of the museum's sort of early acquisitions of modern art. Because at this date, there was actually very little in the contemporary, and it was only in 1935 that a contemporary Welsh art exhibition was organised by what subsequently became the Contemporary Art Society for Wales. And shown in Aberystwyth, Cardiff and Swansea, this exhibition was dominated for a change by the work of living artists, especially Cedric Morris, David Jones, Gwen John and Augustus John. And the National Museum bought from this exhibition and made a number of other contemporary acquisitions during the 1930s. However, after the Second World War, the art collections were to be transformed in scale, range and quality by the bequests of Gwendolyn and Margaret Davis, who you see here. These two sisters were the granddaughters of David Davis, 1818 to 1890, who had pioneered the deep mining of coal in the Rhondda Valley, and made a very considerable fortune. He also went on to be the builder of Barry Docks in the 1890s. His two granddaughters both inherited about £500,000, which of course was a huge amount of money in the early 20th century, and they began to collect art in 1908, first buying paintings by JMW Turner, seen at the top here, and also works by Corot and the French realists like Jean-François Millet, the Girl at Grouchy of 1856. Initially their taste was quite conservative for works of this sort, and indeed for French academic painting, the mid-19th century. But in 1912 they visited an exhibition in Paris of Claude Monet's recent paintings of Venice, made only 4 years before in 1908. And they were blown away by these and bought no less than 4 of them, of which this is one, San Giorgio Maggiore by Twilight, painted in 1908. So when they bought it, it was a picture that was only 4 years old, so it was literally a contemporary piece. And the following year, 1913, Gwendolyn Davis bought the painting on the far side, Renoir's La Parisienne, of 1872, which was one of the principal works in the first Impressionist exhibition in Paris of 1874. And in the same year, she also acquired 3 of Monet's celebrated paintings of water lilies, dated from 1905, 1906, and 1908. Impressionism was still little regarded in Britain, and the sisters were among its earliest collectors here. They were also among Rodin's most committed British patrons, and acquired 9 large sculptures between 1912 and 1917, and in a sense rounding off their collection in 1918, Gwendolyn bought Cézanne's incomparable François de Lazam of 1878, and that was followed in 1920 by Van Gogh's haunting Rain au Vert of 1890, made only a few weeks before he died. And these are among the first works by either artist to enter any British collection, either public or private. And Gwendolyn Davis's pictures and sculpture arrived in Cardiff in 1952, and when her sister Margaret died in 1963, her bequest of 151 works reunited the great collection of French modern art that they'd formed 50 years before. However, Margaret Davis, who was herself an artist, couldn't quite stop collecting. Her sister Gwendolyn had decided in 1924 that she couldn't continue any longer because there were so many other things she ought to be spending her money on. She itemizes Russian refugees, First World War veterans, the unemployed, etc., etc. But Margaret, being an artist, although she was spending much less money, she did continue to buy modern British art right up to her death. And this picture brings me back to Kyffin Williams, because this is the Malouins from Aberglaslyn, painted about 1952, and it's one of 3 works by Kyffin Williams that Margaret Davis bought pretty well new, and this one of Mel Heybug is another. And there are actually 2 even earlier works by Kyffin Williams in the National Museum. This picture, Snowden from Llinantle, given by the Contemporary Art Society of Wales in 1944, painted in 1944 and given in 1947. Interestingly, the composition was cribbed completely from Richard Wilson, which you can see at the top there. And the palette and the colour range recalls James Dixon Innes, the early 20th century Welsh painter who Kyffin also admired. So I'll just go back again. Another early work is this one, Farmer's Comnath of 1947. And I think this is really impressive because his farmer figures that which are to populate his pictures, are really elemental here, and to me they recall European Expressionism of the pre-war period. Constant Premier's Belgian Fisherman, for example, and in the bottom corner, Joseph Herman's Welsh Miners, from much the same date, in the 40s and 50s. And here is Kyffin Williams when he was teaching here in the 1950s and 60s, with some typical works, with a Snowdonia mountain scene on the easel and an Anglesey farm below it. And these images of rural North Wales chimed with a resurgence of Welsh national feeling during the 1950s and 60s. And Williams's work came to be embraced by many as a definitive view of Wales. Yet in a sense, this is a landscape of memory and imagination. It's a landscape that he knew very well, having been brought up on Anglesey, but also having worked as a land agent in that corner of northwest Wales before the war as well. But it was partly recalling the past because he lived and worked here in London until his retirement from the school in 1974. But the inspiration that he drew from the topography of his North Wales homeland is one that never diminished, and he was to work prolifically along the same subjects for the rest of his life. And it's estimated that he produced something like 6,500 oil paintings during the course of his life, which is an extraordinary figure. Like many artists, as he got older, he became increasingly ambivalent about his early work. And you won't be able to read this, but this is a letter to me, dated April 1999, and he's been told that we've got the Queen coming, and she's expressed a wish to see one of his pictures, or perhaps somebody told her she ought to see one of his pictures. And he's very worried that she's going to be shown some of the earlier works that I've just shown you. And these are the two pictures of which he approved that I was to show her, which of course I duly did. And one is an Anglesey seascape, which he did a number at the end of his life. And then Farmers on the Carnedau is a sort of very classic Shepherds and Mountains picture from the 1980s. And he has some form in this respect because here's some more things from our files. This is Kyffin really worried about a portrait that he'd painted of the museum's former president, Sir Twiston Davis, which he didn't like, the sitter didn't like, the museum didn't like, and he really wanted to get it out of the museum and to destroy it. And museums hate giving anything up, of course, as you'll know, and indeed we have all sorts of procedures that rather stop us doing so. But fair dues, on this occasion we actually did agree to do what he wanted, and the portrait of Sir Twiston Davis was duly returned to Kyffin and destroyed, probably much to the relief of the family as well. We received this portrait from the mid-1950s in return. And he did struggle sometimes with portraits because he was in quite considerable demand as a portrait painter in the 50s and 60s, and he rather felt he ought to be doing them because it was somehow good for him. But he did not find it easy, and these are just two in the museum's collection. Hugh T Edwards is somebody who's largely forgotten. Indeed, I didn't know anything about him. But he was a trade union politician, chairman of a body then called the Council of Wales in Monmouthshire, president of the Welsh Language Society for a while. And that, I think, is actually rather a good portrait. But more powerful, I have to say, is the one next to it. And that's a picture of a man called Larry, or William Lee, who was an epileptic, as Kyffin was himself. And Larry had fallen into a fire during a fit and had lost an eye and damaged one arm and became a pretty unhappy recluse as well. But Kyffin made the effort to seek him out and to paint his portrait. I gather that both of them found that this was a therapeutic experience. I mentioned that Kyffin was on the museum's art committee for some 30 years, and he was a promoter there of artists he admired. He was a great supporter of the sculptor Ivor Roberts-Jones, and the museum in fact has 20 pieces of sculpture by Ivor Roberts-Jones, and I did an exhibition on him a couple of years ago. But Ivor Roberts-Jones came from Oswestry, but he and Kyffin regarded themselves to some extent as the Welsh diaspora in London in the early 1950s, and did support each other, hence this bust of Kyffin, which the museum duly acquired. And then we got Ivor Roberts-Jones at Kyffin's encouragement to do a whole sequence of busts of our presidents, our honorary chief officers. And then on the upper part of the screen, a painting of Snowdonia by a man called William Cole, who's completely forgotten, at least as far as I can see. But he had been at the Slade in exile in Oxford with Kyffin Williams during the war, and greatly admired his work and gave examples of it to 2 or 3 Welsh collections, including ours. One of his teachers at the Slade was somebody who is now rather forgotten, but I think unjustly so, a painter called Alan Gwyn-Jones, and this is a farm at Zenor in Cornwall in 1919, but he's somebody who Kyffin Williams didn't forget and pushed his cause, and indeed was involved in the museum doing a retrospective exhibition of his work in the early 1980s. And again, Kyffin Williams is a member of the art committee, writing to my predecessor Rollo Charles, "Dear Rollo, I have seen a Carrie Richards self-portrait in the Marlborough galleries, and I took the liberty to reserve it for the museum in case it was bought, etc., etc." And his advice was duly followed, and the picture was acquired, and it's one of a number of artists' self-portraits that we held. One of the seminal transformational events in Kyffin Williams' life was the Churchill Fellowship that he received in 1968 to record the Welsh community in Patagonia and the landscape of that part of Argentina. And he recorded later that when I got back, I offered my drawings to the National Museum of Wales, and I wrote to the keeper and arranged to go down and see him. This is Rollo Charles, who he's writing to there. Drove down to Brangwyn and found he wasn't in. He turned up an hour late and said he was too busy to see me. And I said I'd come down to offer him any of the drawings I'd done. He said, well, if you're here now, we'd better have a look at them. So he looked at the drawings for a bit, and I said, you don't want any, do you? He said, no. So I drove back to Anglesey, and I offered them to the National Library, who said, thank you very much. I'm a bit worried about this, as you might imagine, because normally one treats members of one's committee with great respect, but there is a slightly happier footnote to this, because the museum did actually buy the principal painting from his Argentina trip, which was this one, Dyffryn Cymru, and also one or two drawings as well. But we bought these from the Welsh Gallery for a reasonable amount of money, £450, I think, the following year. So it was a question of actually making sure we had what we wanted and could use, rather than a collection of drawings that we would presumably have to spend a certain amount of time and money on actually conserving, which we presumably didn't really want to do. But anyway, that was one of the brushes that we had with him, at any rate. And I'm really glad they did buy that picture, actually, because it's terrific work, tonal, almost abstract, and you can see it's worked heavily with the palette knife, and as he got older, his palette knife was more and more important to him. During his time on the art committee, we did actually acquire quite a number of major 20th century works by British artists, among them Francis Bacon, seen at the top here, Graham Sutherland and many others, and the expansive period ushered in by the Davis bequest, and also finally having quite a bit more money from government in the opulent 1960s and 70s, greatly extended the international character of the Cardiff collections, and purchases of works by Derain and Magritte, seen here in the lower corner, and others introduced the work of the Fauve, of Expressionism and Surrealism. And this period also saw a spectacular growth in the museum's holdings of Welsh artists of the 20th century, particularly the London Welsh painter David Jones, who's a particular hero of mine, and also of Carrie Richards, whose self-portrait you've just seen. The residue of Augustus John's studio collection was bought in 1972, which was perhaps not quite such a good idea, and that of his sister Gwen followed in 1976, which was perhaps a better one. And during this period, holdings of Kyffin Williams' own work also grew, mainly now by gift and bequest. And this is a particular favourite of mine. It's Pencameth, which is an abandoned farm near Llansadden in Anglesey, where his mother's father had been rector, and it dates from the late 1950s, and it's still quite painterly and less sort of palette knifey than the later pictures. And then we've a number of the darker, more textured works from the 1970s and 80s, like these two, Line Nan Franklin number 1 of 1978 and Anglesey Cottages and Cattle. Kyffin Williams came on both sides from English-speaking Anglesey professional families. Many of his forebears were Anglican vicars, soldiers and lawyers, and his father was a bank manager in the days when bank managers were bank managers. One member of that very widespread Williams family made a huge fortune at the end of the 18th century, which is this guy here, Thomas Williams, who was not a direct ancestor but a collateral, and he was the chief agent for the Manor Paris copper mines near Amlwch, and he did extremely well for himself, and was really one of the leading figures of the early stage of the Industrial Revolution. And the portrait here was painted by the young Sir Thomas Lawrence right at the beginning of his career, and it hung at Williams's country seat in Berkshire, And if you're ever driving around Berkshire and you find that instead of a hedge or a fence, you've actually got one of those North Wales slate fences. That's Temple House, and it's the one sort of memory of Thomas Williams and the slate connection. But what he made his money in was copper, and the family did the usual thing. They, being incredibly rich, they were members of Parliament and in the lifeguards and that sort of thing. And the last of them married a Romanian prince, I think, and ended up in Los Angeles. And that picture was knocking around on the American art market. So we bought it from a dealer who I remember was very worried that he wasn't sure how long it was going to take him to fly from London to Cardiff. So it was all right to get the train. So he duly came and we bought the thing, much to Kyffin's delight, in fact. And he gave us a drawing of the Paris copper mine, which is this huge derelict industrial landscape, seen in operation at the top by J.C. Ibbotson in the 1790s, and then in dereliction by Kyffin Williams in the 1990s. During my time at the museum, Kyffin argued repeatedly that there should be a gallery within the museum purely for the work of Welsh artists up to 1950 to showcase the best of Welsh art. And this is quoting another letter from our files. This is to my predecessor Timothy Stevens, saying in fact that he was going to have to postpone their talk about a Welsh gallery because he has got somebody coming to see him to write a book about it, which is duly modest. And then very modestly he says, but he's coming south fairly soon because he's going to be staying with some friends near Abergavenny. And I realised that was Nicholas Edwards, the Secretary of State, who was our ultimate paymaster, but he was very discreet about that, so which I thought was rather nice. But anyway, this is a list of the artists that should be in his Welsh gallery, and these are all people who figure prominently in our collection, and indeed in many cases we've continued to collect. But the idea of having them all corralled together in a single room was one that always made us rather nervous, because in the late 20th century we didn't really want to create a shrine to the glorious dead, which is what this would have been. And of course some of these artists never lived or worked in Wales beyond childhood. And our thinking was further complicated by the so-called new art history of the period, the impact since the 1970s of feminist, Marxist, structuralist and socio-political ideas on our discipline. And also influential in Wales had been post-colonial theory, which celebrates art produced in response to the aftermath of colonial rule, and frequently addresses issues of national and cultural identity. And there's some very interesting stuff going on in Wales at that date, most of which would have caused Kyffin to burst a blood vessel, I think, because he was in many respects a cultural conservative. He was deeply proud of his craft as a landscape painter and of his membership of the Royal Academy, to which he was elected in 1974, at a point when many British artists were turning their back on that venerable institution. And he was highly critical of much contemporary art and of art school teaching, with a particular loathing for abstraction and the conceptual. And that, I'm afraid, made him the go-to person for any new art for the Welsh media, because they could be relied upon to sound off about whatever it was. And that sort of brings me back to the National Museum, and these are some of the pictures that by artists that he wanted us to show, and some of them are really pretty obscure. The letter I've just shown you says, oh, and then there is George Jones, R.A. I think he was Welsh because he was a friend of my family. And George Jones is a pretty obscure Victorian battle painter, born and died in London, though I think that his family came from Radnorshire. And then at the bottom you've got Larn by Morden Lewis, who's a very decent sort of British Impressionist painter, born in Carmarthenshire and died in North Africa, in fact, in 1943. And one of the few women artists that he mentions, Brenda Chamberlain, who is born Bangor, fascinating figure, also a writer, interesting, sad life really, somebody who knew Leonard Cohen and Marion Elan on Hydra, which is a sort of extraordinary connection, of which I imagine Kyffin Williams would have been unaware. But putting them all together in one space was something we really didn't feel very comfortable with. So when we were finally able to extend the art galleries and completely reorganise them a few years later, we went to a public consultation, which is what, of course, all organisations always do on these occasions. And we actually found it really rather an enriching experience. And we were asked for lots of things. We were asked for more work by Welsh artists. We were asked for more work relevant to people's lives. We were certainly asked for much more modern and contemporary art and more art in new media. So when we got to, these are the better half of Kyffin's list. This is Richard Wilson and Gwen John, but we'll move on from them. When I finally got to play with it all and do our redisplay between 2007 and 2011, we divided the whole of the upper floor of the building, which was our patch, into 4 zones that dealt with historic art on this side here, what we called modern, Impressionism, 2 modern, the 6 galleries in the centre, and then contemporary, which was pretty well anything from the 1960s onwards, got a third of the building on that side. And then applied art, craft and photography, which is something we got much into, particularly craft and photography in the previous 20 years or so, was at the front of the building here. And we regarded some spaces as being more or less fixed. I mean, they were the 18th century gallery or the Impressionist gallery, though they obviously changed as pictures went in and out online or acquisitions were made or other reasons for change. Others were spaces that we wanted to change regularly in a planned sort of way, though actually keeping that up when the money began to disappear after 2009 became increasingly difficult, but there we are. And just to look at a few of them, this is one of the galleries in the historic zone on the eastern side of the building, where we put together a hang demonstrating the impact of the Welsh landscape on artists from the picturesque tour days of the 1770s right through to the present. And Kyffin Williams's Farmers on the Gunneddau finds a place there, of course, and I think it's interesting having that close to a North Wales painting by John Piper, who produced an extraordinary body of work in North Wales between the 1940s, really. And that's an oil from that group. And then in the centre of the Welsh Landscape Gallery, we've a wood sculpture by David Nash, who's somebody we've done quite a bit with, including a very successful major survey of his work last year. But then also within the historic zone, there's a Welsh portrait gallery and a room devoted to my hero Richard Wilson in the 18th century and his pupil Thomas Jones, and a few others like John Diamond and William Parry. And in the Impressionist modern zone, of course, we have the Impressionist gallery. We've also a new English art club gallery for British artists of the early 20th century. But we also have one room for changing exhibitions of work by artists of this period. And we're very strong in the works of people like Augustus John, Gwen John, Carrie Richards, Cedric Morris, David Jones, and many others. And on the screen here, the exhibition we did as part of this series on Kyffin Williams. It actually explored his relationship with the museum, which is partly what this talk is based on, though it was actually curated by, not by me, but by one of my colleagues. And then this is the contemporary zone, and up the top here you've got extraordinary work. It's actually just come in by an artist called Carrie Richards, who is Welsh speaker from North Wales, who works entirely on neon. And we had quite a lot of trouble with the Conservatives with their parenting to remember. But we eventually managed to sort out a major work of his with help actually from the Contemporary Arts Centre of Great Britain. But this is called Radiant Fold, Illuminating Gas, and it dates from 2 years ago, 2018, and it draws inspiration from Marcel Duchamp's iconic work, Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, of 1915 to 23. So it's and what you've got are three vast discs in bright white neon, recreating the forms of Duchamp's original into three-dimensional and multi-dimensional objects. And then below that, a work by the land artist Richard Long called Blaenau Circle 2011. And I rather divide artists into those that we enjoyed working with and those that we didn't, or didn't so much. And Richard Long was great. And what I thought was particularly touching was that he spent ages selecting these lumps of slate from Blaenau and I wanted to photograph it and number every piece so we knew how to put it back together again, etc., etc. He said, no, it's yours now, and next time you put it together you must do it the way you want to put it together. Needless to say, we did photograph it and number every piece. However, oh yes, I mentioned photography. Photography is something that we have come late to, but with some enthusiasm. And on the screen is a work by the radical American photographer W. Eugene Smith, and it's an iconic picture of his called Welsh Miners in 1950. And when we had that in a show, it was rather nice that one of the three guys, a man called Vernon Harding, was actually still alive, and there he is pointing at himself some 50 years later. So we do South Wales as well as North Wales, shall I say. However, I'm going to finish by returning to Kyffin Williams and a final act of generosity to the National Museum. He'd in fact long been a donor, mostly of family things, such as some pieces of 18th century silver, and mysteriously a James Wyatt chair from Plas Newydd, and quite how he got that I don't know, but that was passed on to us. And when he died in 2006, he left the museum all his pictures, with the exception of the residue of his own work, which he bequeathed to the National Library. And as with other artist collections, the pictures that he lived with are rather touching and help, I think, illuminate his own work and his personality. One of them was this lovely still life of oysters, painted by a fairly obscure French artist called Mel Heybug in about 1870. But it's a real painter's picture with this wonderful thick white impasto. And on the far side, you've got Kyffin in Bothenagel surrounded by his pictures with a big wash drawing by Georges Rouault, French expressionist, by his head. Two little seascapes painted by Frederick Leighton, president of the Royal Academy in the late 19th century, the coast of Asia Minor, sort of seascapes of the Aegean, painted in the late 1860s, and several family portraits as well. And the picture on the bottom there is of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Piers Williams of the Lifeguards, who was the son of the Copper King, was one of the people who spent all the money, son or grandson rather. But I'd just like to conclude with an assessment and a tribute really from a friend of mine called Andrew Green, who was head of the National Library of Wales until recently. And I think what he writes here about Kyffin Williams is better than I could do. So I'm just going to quote him, if I may. Because he talks about there being three Kyffin Williamses. Firstly, there's Kyffin the public man, or character, the moustachioed and tweedy gentleman, the bluff raconteur, the friend of aristocracy and gentry who could talk to anyone, the brusque enemy of abstract and modern art. Second, and in contrast, is Kyffin the private person, the man who suffered from epilepsy and from depression, the complex mix of self-belief and uncertainty about his own worth, the leading light who felt himself the victim of the establishment. So perhaps in this sense the museum was the establishment. This Kyffin was rarely on show except to close friends. And then there's Kyffin the artist, the creator of a large body of work, and for work read landscape, because for most people it was his landscapes, the landscapes of Aurori and of Anglesey, that defined his art and were indeed a construct of national identity. Thank you. Definitely, thank you.